Hey guys, so today I thought I would give you my top 7 mixing tips. Um, Especially if you're a beginner, or even you've got some experience. I think if you follow these pretty simple tips, they're going to really help improve your mixes. So let's start with probably my most important tip that I can give you is, when you have a mix going, you want to put a low cut filter on every track, generally, except the kick and the bass. So, let's just pull up the snare track. I'm using Softube Console 1. So as you can see, you want to roll off everything, usually at around 100. And that's just, when you have like so many tracks and you have like 30, 40 tracks, if you don't do that, you're going to get this low end buildup, and it's going to create mud, and it's going to sound, just make things sound awful. So that right there cleans up your mix. So obviously, it has to work with the track. So like if you have like a tabla instrument that has a lot of bass, obviously you don't want to do that probably because you're highlighting that instrument. But generally on most mixes, especially pop, hip hop, R&B, it generally works. So like I said, put it on every single track. I'm using Softube Console 1. If you're using just a standard mixer plugin in Cubase, you just activate it and you roll everything off, and there you go. So it's as easy as that. And on the kick, I do put a low cut, but as you can see by the frequency, it's the super low. Like you're not really hearing anything at that point, but there's that theory that there's still something there. So, roll it off. So like I said, kick and bass, like around 30, everything else, 100. So let's go to tip number 2. I would say put saturation or a tape type plugin on practically every track. Now, with me, one of the reasons that I do like the Softube Console 1 is that it's built into the channel strip. So on every track, I try to have the drive set up at 5. And what's that's basically doing is it's just creating a little bit of harmonic distortion, and it's emulating basically a console. So if you don't have this, you can go in and just put any saturation or tape type plugin that you have. I believe Cubase already comes with what do they have, like Magento? I think it's in there. Magneto, sorry, I keep forgetting that thing. So yeah, you can just play with that, put a little bit of it, and basically what that does is, I just want to give you a big little background on this. I started off on analog consoles. I had a big console and a stack of outboard gear, and then in 2002 I decided to go to the Pro Tools, and I bought a massive Pro Tools rig. I had the Control 24 HD3 system. I spent ridiculous money back then, and then I started just I took a few weeks off just to really learn how to mix in the box. And I was baffled because my mixes in the box sounded horrible compared to what I was doing on my console. And it really took me some time to figure out that it was, the big difference was the harmonic distortion that I was getting on the console. It just made things better, like just sound better. It glued the mix a lot easier. So if you're mixing inside the box with just software, you basically want to try to emulate that. It makes things sound more forward, more glued together, and that's how you can do it. So I would suggest pretty much put it on every track or most tracks, basic saturation or tape. So let's go to number 3. Pre-delay on your vocal reverb. So if you like reverb, you like a reverb sound on your voice, don't drown out the voice. So, when I started, the thing to do was just to, slap a reverb on it and put some reverb, and then suddenly the voice is not prominent anymore. So if you have a vocal send reverb, let's just say, in this case we have a random hall. If you just put it on the vocal, suddenly the vocal goes further in the mix, and you're losing, you probably start losing the voice. So what you want to do is put a pre-delay on it so that the reverb kicks in a little bit later. And the key to doing this is usually you want to time it to the track, so you crank it up, and you put it so that it's pretty much a quarter note. So it would start at a quarter note later. So that's obviously depends on the tempo of the song. I have a tutorial on mixing vocals that I actually go step by step, and you can actually see it in action. But that's very important, because if you put the pre-delay, the voice is still nice and present. Right, it's up front, it's forward, but you're getting that nice reverb because it kicks in a little bit later. So that is a very important tip that I wish I knew, way back in the day when I started mixing. So number 4, don't compress everything. So I see a lot of up-and-coming engineers, and I've dealt with a lot of the tracks they would bring me, and there's, I pull up a mix that has 50, 60 tracks, and everything is compressed. So imagine, like, every single track is compressed, and highly compressed, mind you. And then you're going to run it through a mix bus compressor and a maximizer or multi-band compressor on the mix. Suddenly everything is sounding horrible. So keep that in mind, especially if you're using samples. Like if you're using like a kick sample, it's probably already compressed. So pull it up. If it sounds good, don't compress it. That might sound shocking, but no, you don't need to compress everything. So even when I do my mixes, if I'm using a lot of samples, I might compress a little bit on a lot of tracks, but it's mainly just to kind of tame the peaks and just to smooth it out a little bit, but not really for effect. If you're doing something for effect, yes, you can put a 10-to-1 ratio and really squash it, but that's different. But when you're doing a whole mix, you don't have to compress every instrument and every sound. So keep that in mind. And what you also should keep in mind is most likely, most people do, I don't mix through a mix bus compressor, but I do put it on the end of the mix. But that is going to catch a little something too. The mix bus compressor is going to compress a little something, especially like dominant sounds like kicks and bass and snare. It's going to kind of catch something through that. So keep that in mind. You're going to get 1 or 2 dBs off of that. So that's, the main thing is you want your mixes to have some life. You don't want to squash the crap out of everything. That's like the biggest mistake you can do. The next very important tip is to watch your headroom. If you're mixing with software, you don't have the benefit of mixing on an analog console that you can actually mix into the red and have that nice analog distortion. So under no circumstances should you ever peak at 0. Never. If you're doing that, you're really making like the biggest rookie mistake you can do. Your mix is going to sound small and horrible and clipped. So don't do it. So here, always watch your meter. When I'm ready to mix, if I'm starting with my kick, I usually want it to sit around here. And then you start, building your mix, and then things would likely start peaking at around here. And then when you're ready to master, if you're mastering your own things, then yes, then you're going to put a limiter on the mix bus and, compressor on the mix bus as well, and then a maximizer or whatever plugin you're using to get the levels up. Then you're playing with that. But the mix should breathe. It should breathe, and you have to watch those levels. So the next important tip is to monitor your levels on your speakers at a low level. If you start cranking things and you start listening at loud levels, you're not hearing things properly. And especially if you're working in an untreated room, you're going to get all these waves bouncing from all over the place, and your mix is going to sound horrible. So that's the one thing, especially, if you're in a little tiny place like I am, you want to mix at a low level and make things sound good. And then obviously when you're checking your mix, yes, you can start cranking it here and there just to check especially your kick and your bass. The way that I mix, I don't have a properly treated room, so I have to mix at low levels. And then I do have high-end headphones that I use, and between the two, I get pretty good results, and I'm just used to working that way. So the next thing is to not treat individual channels. Treat everything as a mix. So I do this quite often. When I'm starting a mix, I'll pull up my kick channel and I'll start getting a nice sound that I like. And that kind of just sets the bar for like the kick for the drum group. And then I'll pull up a snare and I start EQing, but I don't always solo just the snare, just the clap, just the hi-hat. I do sometimes when I want to check things, but generally, I'll pull up the snare and I'll start EQing it, and I'm listening with the kick. And then I'll pull up my next sound, my clap, and I'll start EQing and listening to how that works with the snare and the kick together, and so on and so forth with everything else, the bass, because that's the thing, you're building a mix, and if you start treating things individually that they sound good on their own, well, it's probably not, what are the chances that it's going to sound good in the mix? You're working with a full spectrum. So your ultimate goal is to have a nice sounding mix that breathes and that is full in the entire spectrum. Your vocals are going to sit in a certain pocket in the EQ, and then you might have pianos and pads and surrounding the vocals, but you don't want things fighting each other. So that's the reason why usually, you don't want to isolate absolutely every sound and make it sound perfect with effects, because it changes in the mix. Like, if you're working on a synth and you put delays and stuff, yes, you can isolate it and listen to it on its own, but it's going to sound different in the mix. So that's the thing. If you EQ a piano in the mix, you might use some radical EQ. Like it might look like something like this, where on its own, it might actually sound horrible. It's like, whoa, what the hell did you do to that piano? It's distorted. I mean, you cranked up the drive, you EQ'd it radically. It might sound awful on its own, but in the mix, it might work with everything else that's going. So it's vice versa. It can work either way. So that's the main thing. Just treat your sounds in the mix and not individually, because your ultimate goal is to get a good mix. So I hope that was helpful. Like I said, those are my top 7 mix tips. But be sure to check out my other tutorials, because on the full mix tutorials, I'm actually going to go step by step and show you exactly what I do. So that's it for today, and I hope you enjoyed that. If you have absolutely any questions, just leave me a comment and I'll do my best to answer it. Thank you.